welcome to Agriculture for Life's first video in our new video series, The STEM of Agriculture, where we're going to explore all sorts of fun hands-on activities, demonstrations, and experiments all related to food and agriculture, and using things that you probably already have in your own home. Today we're going to start off by talking about a vegetable that most of you are likely familiar with, the potato. The potato has become a very important food staple all across the world. And the main reason for that is the potato is an excellent source of energy. The potato has a very high amount of starch in it, and starch is a type of carbohydrate. The purpose of the potato is actually to store energy for the potato plant itself. But luckily for us, we've discovered that they're also quite delicious and an excellent source of energy for humans as well. Now, because the starch molecule is so important to the potato, our first STEM activity today is going to be to see if we can actually isolate some of those starch molecules from the potato. So you might be familiar with cornstarch. You might have some in your cupboard. It's a very fine white powdery substance, and the potato starch should end up looking and feeling pretty much the same as the cornstarch, and it would have all the same purposes as well. You can use it for thickening soups. You can make some fun Play-Doh out of it, which we might try later as well. To get started, isolating the starch molecules out of our potato, we're going to make sure that we have all the materials necessary. So first of all, you're going to start with potatoes. You probably need 2 or 3 to get a good amount of starch produced at the end. So I have pre-peeled here about 5 yellow potatoes, and they must be nicely peeled and washed. I've cut out any extra little brown spots, so they are nice, perfectly peeled potatoes. You're going to need some cheesecloth because we're going to need to strain the potatoes once we rinse out the starch. You're going to need a large tray. You're going to need a grater. Now, the starch molecules are actually held inside the cells of the potato. So in order for us to extract the starch molecules, we actually need to demolish the potato cells. The way that we're going to do that is by grating. You can use the front side of the grater if you want a bigger grate, but if you really want to extract more starch, the finer the grate, the better. So I'm going to use the grater on the back. I also have a clear container here that I'm going to use to pour off some of the starchy liquid once we get the potatoes pulverized. But you're likely going to use something larger than that. So I've got actually a nice big bowl set aside to put most of my liquid in. But I wanted to use this clear cylinder for some of it just so that we can observe really nice and easily what's happening as the starch starts to separate from the rest of the liquid. And then I also have a measuring cup here, and I just got this out because it has a nice pour spout, and I think it'll help me to scoop out some of my potato liquid without making too much of a mess. Okay, so now that I have all of my materials set out, I need to get started grating up my potatoes. So as I said, the finer the grate you can get, the more starch you're going to be able to release from the cells of the potato. So we're going to get to work. I'll see you in a little bit. As you can see, I have finished grating all of my potatoes and made kind of this nice grated potato mush. And I can actually see that the liquid that's starting to pool in the bottom has a bit of a whitish tinge to it. And so those are already some of the starch molecules being released. So now that I have finished pulverizing my potato cells, I would like to now rinse these potatoes to try to remove all of the starch. So what you're going to do, and you don't really have to measure this, is you're going to just add enough water to completely cover the potatoes. Now, as I do this, I'm also going to rinse off my cheese grater because I don't want to lose any of the starch that's likely stuck from the grating process. Now that I'm done with that, I put that in the sink. And I'm going to continue to cover the rest of my potatoes with just a nice lukewarm water. Just a room temperature water. It doesn't have to be hot or anything like that. So now that we have the potatoes completely covered, we're just going to mix that up a little bit. You can kind of think of this as rinsing laundry. All the potato pieces are kind of like your clothes, and you want to just kind of keep rinsing them to rinse all the starch off of the potato pieces that are left. So now that I have my potato and my water mixed nicely together, I'm going to take my cheesecloth and I'm going to strain the liquid out of this mush that I've created. I had a rather big piece of cheesecloth, so I just rolled it up around the edge, and it's going to sit nice and tight in there. I'm going to use my measuring cup that has a nice pour spout. I'm going to get a nice bunch of this liquid, and I'm going to pour it through the cheesecloth into my clear cylinder. That's okay if you get some of the chunks, because the cheesecloth will strain it out. And you can see the color of the liquid that's straining through. It's quite a brown color. So that liquid will contain all of the vitamins and minerals and nutrients that are dissolved in the liquid of the potato. Now the rest I'm going to strain as well, but I'm going to use my nice big bowl. These will stretch all the way around. Ooh, just about slingshotted my potatoes right out of the bowl. Okay. Now I'm going to continue. I might be able to pour this now. Pour the liquid and all of the potato puree into the bowl, through the cheesecloth. Don't worry if you don't get every last bit, but scrape it out as well as you can. You can already see the white residue that's forming on the plate here. Okay, here we go. Just squeeze all of the liquid. Actually, maybe we'll put some more in this one. Got most of the liquid out now, but we will not have gotten all of the starch quite yet. So just like laundry, when it's really dirty, it might need a double rinse. So we're going to dump what's left of the potato back into the tray. And I'm going to add some more warm, clean water. Again, we only need enough to cover the potatoes. So we've probably rinsed quite a bit of the starch out already, but we want to get as much starch out as we can so that we have a nice sample to work with. Mix them around. Let all that starch get into the water. Again, cover the bowl with the cheesecloth. Pour what's left and strain it again. Now that we've strained a lot of the starch off, the potato pieces are kind of crisp and just not mushy like they were before. So probably make do with a smaller piece of cheesecloth here, but you guys squish it out. Get all of the liquid out that you can. I think that should be enough to get us some starch to work with. If I look really closely at my clear container, I can already see on the bottom a very thin white layer. That's the starch. So we're going to let this now sit for a while. Because the starch molecules are not actually dissolved in the water, they're just suspended in the liquid. That means if we leave this liquid to just sit and settle for a little while, the starch molecules should start to settle on the bottom. And in fact, I can see them starting to accumulate on the bottom already. So we'll let this sit for another half hour or so, and we'll see how big the white layer on the bottom is. And then we'll take the next step. So as you can see, I have allowed the potato liquid to settle for about a half an hour. And you can see in that time that a layer of the white starch has settled at the bottom of our clear container. And so you can imagine the same thing is happening inside our bigger bowl of liquid as well. So now that we've managed to separate the starch and all of this liquid from the potatoes, which I'm going to keep to make hash browns later, by the way, now the goal is to separate the rest of the liquid from the starch. Now because the starch molecules are heavy and large and settled to the bottom, we can get rid of most of the liquid just by really gently pouring it off. So again, you don't want to jostle your container around too much because you don't want to mix the starch up again. But if you pick up your container, you should just gently pour, and you should be able to pour off a lot of the excess liquid without pouring off the starch that has settled in the bottom. So you want to do this slowly, gently. Do not want to disrupt those starch molecules. I'm going to leave a little bit. I'm not going to pour the very last bit because I can imagine there's still some starch left in the bottom and I don't want to pour all of it off. But I can discard this liquid that I've poured off. And just so you know, I'm actually not pouring it down the drain. I'm pouring it into my soup pot so that I can use this to make some nice veggie stock with later, because of course we don't want to be wasting any of our wonderful potato nutrients. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with this big bowl very slowly. I'm going to pour the liquid off. And once that's done, I'm going to actually refill with, again, some clean, just room temperature water. I am just going to pour some clean water back into my starch liquid. So now we can really tell the difference between the original water, which looks like this, okay, and this water now that we have poured off a lot of the potato juice. So now it's almost white, a little bit, still has a little bit of maybe a beige tint to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to let this settle again. So again, we're kind of repeating what we did with the potatoes. With the potatoes, we kept rinsing the actual potato fibers. This is sort of like we're rinsing off the actual starch molecules now. Because again, those starch molecules won't dissolve in the water, they'll settle to the bottom, and the other molecules that are going to diffuse into the water will pour it off at the end. So the more we're able to sort of wash this starch, the more pure it will be. So I just want to show you that I poured all of the liquid off the top out of the big bowl, and you can see that we had quite a nice clump of starch settled at the bottom of the bowl. So I think what I'm going to do, just so that we only have to work with one container, is I'm going to scrape the starch out of the big bowl and add it to my cup. And so we'll go ahead and we'll let this sit for another half hour or so. We'll see how much is settled, and then we will pour it off once again and see if we can purify it a little bit farther before we dry it up into its dry starch form. We've let our starch and water mixture set for another about 30 minutes or so, and we can see that we have got a really nice collection of these starch molecules at the bottom of our container. So again, I'm just going to really gently pour off the top liquid. You can see it's not quite white, it's a little bit discolored, so that tells us that there's still some more minerals and things that are dissolved in there. We want to get rid of them, so we're going to pour them off. All right, now that I have managed to remove the remainder of my starch and water mixture from my cylinder and poured it into my pie plate, we can take a look at what we've got here. So as you can see, it's a nice white mixture, and all that's left in here are the large starch molecules mixed with a little bit of water. And well, in our sample, I have to admit, I see a few little impurities just because we've been playing with it quite a bit along the way. So one of the fun things that we get to do now is play with our starch water mixture. Starch and water makes a really interesting substance. Some of you might know it as oobleck, kind of a silly name for a substance that's just kind of fun to play around with. And what makes oobleck so much fun is that it is something called a non-Newtonian fluid. Now that sounds really fancy, but all it really means is that it exists in two separate states depending on the conditions. So when there's no force or anything being applied to it, you can see that it's really loose and runny like a liquid. If I just leave it to run on its own, it runs around like a liquid. But if I apply a force to it, so for example, if I try to pour it in my hand, it pours as liquid, but when I squeeze it, momentarily turns into a solid. And then when I release it, when I remove the force, you can see it turns back into kind of a fluid, more of a liquid state. I'm just going to spread it down on this black foam mat because that'll give us a nice contrast in color. And I'm just going to pour it out. If I tried to scrape it out, it would be a lot harder because it would turn to solid. There we go. So I'm going to set this aside. Great. And now we're just going to leave our oobleck starch and water mixture on this platform to dry for a couple of days, and we'll see what we get. So we're back to see how our potato starch has dried up. So I have left my damp starch to dry out on this piece of black styrofoam paper just so we could have some nice contrast. And you can see how it has dried into a fine white powder. There's a few clumps that have kind of formed as it dried, but you can break them apart between your fingertips. And this starch is just so soft and powdery. It really feels, once you've squished up those little blocks, it really feels just like cornstarch. And just to show you how similar it has turned out, I've got a little bowl of cornstarch right here. So if you do this at home, make sure to take some time at the end and make a comparison between your potato starch and the cornstarch to see how similar it is. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I hope you take the time to try this STEM potato activity out yourself, and we'll see you on the next STEM of Agriculture.